Your Majesty, thank you all. And thank you, Ingrid, for inviting me. Okay, oh man, it's 3 o'clock. Now at home, where I live in Minnesota, it's time to wake up. But I think I want to roll over and take a little nap now, because it's been a long and very interesting day. So maybe we should begin with a little bit of audience participation. Who here is connected to higher education in some way? Okay. Who here is connected to, I guess what we would call elementary education in our country? So, okay. Who's connected to high school in some way? Who's connected to elementary? Maybe age 6 to 12, 6 to 9. How about early childhood? Anyone connected to early childhood? And how many people are here today? Almost everybody. Good, good. So a lot of people are connected to education. And I have a question for you. I want you to consider this question. What should school be for? If you're connected to education, you've thought about that. If you have a child, you've thought about that. I want today to think a little bit more about that, and I want to frame some of our thinking with a quote from this man. Does anybody know who this is? He wrote that book. Okay, one more show of hands. Who's read Future Shock? Who's even heard of it? This man is Alvin Toffler. And not long ago, he said, the illiterate of the 21st century will not be those who cannot read and write, but those who cannot learn, unlearn, and relearn. And that resonates, doesn't it? It resonates with all of us. And at a certain level, we understand that he's referring to this. He's referring to the toolkit that resides within each of our ears, within, inside of our heads. He's talking about a brain that works well, that can adapt. There's some things we know about brains. We know, for example, that brains develop, but they don't develop automatically. We know that brain development is experience dependent. And if you remember nothing else from my few minutes with you here today, remember that. Brain development is experience dependent. And when we consider the question, what should school be for? I would like to offer my answer to that question. Maybe it's yours too. School should be for assisting this process, for doing everything necessary to help every developing brain get its best shot at going as far as it can go. There are individual differences in capability. Some brains can go further than others. But I want to offer to you that the purpose of school should be to help every developing brain get its best shot. And what's important is that we know an awful lot about how to give every developing brain its best shot. And so I'd like to spend a few minutes talking about some things that we know about how to give every developing brain its best shot. For starters, I need to begin by talking about movement, cognition, and executive functions. And now all of you will go to sleep, because it sounds kind of dry, doesn't it? All of us have seen some kind of an illustration or a diagram like this, kind of a medical drawing of a human body. Maybe some of you know that the human body is actually mapped on the surface of your brain. In fact, it's mapped in two places. There's a part of the surface of our brain that has a map of our body that has to do with movement, and another one that has to do with sensory processing. And as we look at how that map is laid out on the surface of our brain, we're looking now kind of like at a slice of bread, okay? So this is the surface of the brain. You might notice something interesting about that map. You might notice that that map does not exactly represent the version of your body that you're accustomed to seeing, right? You might notice there where the two hemispheres face each other, that's where the feet are, and the feet are kind of small in their representation. We see as we roll along the surface of the brain that the hand is remarkable in its representation on that map of our body and our brain. And as you go further, you see that the mouth and face are also remarkably represented. And this is the neurological explanation for why necking feels so good. Kissing, making out. Because there's so much sensation around this part of our face that there's a lot of input there when we're with our partners. Or ideally, there's a lot of input there when we're with our partners. And if you take that map of your brain and make a figure out of it, this is the figure you get. This is called the sensory motor homunculus. And this is you. This is you, I would argue, in a more realistic way than the version of you that you see in the mirror in the morning after you take a shower, because this is your brain's version of you. And what is your brain all about? Your brain is all about hands. In fact, think about this when you see a young child engaging with the world. What do? They grab, they touch, it goes to the mouth as well, but they're engaging with the world using their hands. I want to share with you some research about how important the hands and movement are when it comes to cognitive development. This is Dr. Adele Diamond. She's a world-famous developmental cognitive neuroscientist. This is an article she published in the year 2000. Quite a title, Close Interrelation of Motor Development and Cognitive Development and of the Cerebellum and Prefrontal Cortex. Motor development and cognitive development may be fundamentally interrelated, more so than has been previously appreciated. They may be fundamentally intertwined. Cognition, thinking, and movement are intertwined. Another paper, long title, Cognition is Unavoidably Linked to Movement, Rodney Cotterill, 2001. Cognition is unavoidably linked to movement. A recent book published in my field by two friends of mine, Len Koziel and Deb Budding. Len recently wrote to me, he said, you know, it's like this, Steve, a vertebrate brain did not evolve or develop to think. A brain evolved to control action. Plain and simple. It is all for the control of action, meaning the control of movement. Your brain, all of your brain, evolved to control movement. Now, this is another essential part of your brain. This is the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex is involved in sequencing, coordinating, and programming motor sequences. But we also use it for some other pretty important things. We use it for this domain of reasoning skills that we call executive functions. It's important for problem solving, for reasoning, and for planning, and most fundamentally, it's essential for profound, vital cognitive operations necessary for all effective human behavior. It's here where resides inhibitory control, the ability to stop and think before acting. It's here where working memory resides, which is where we hold information while we perform some process on it, essential for creativity, essential for empathy. And it's here where resides cognitive flexibility. When we are pursuing plan A and that's not working out, how do we make the shift to plan B? Some of us are married to people who don't know how to shift to plan B. You might have direct awareness of how important that capability is. Executive functions have been shown to be more important for school readiness than IQ or early reading or math skills. In a paper published by Dr. Diamond, she writes, clearly to improve school readiness and academic success, targeting executive functions is critical. EFs remain critical for success throughout life and for positive mental and physical health. And here's our friend again, the sensory motor homunculus, because one of the most important ways we can develop the prefrontal cortex is by engaging in certain kinds of motor activity. Here we see a child from the article who's practicing Taekwondo. It turns out that classical martial arts, which requires the precise sequencing of motor movements, supports the development of this region in the brain. And here we see a picture of a child in a Montessori classroom. This is for you, Ingrid. And this child is performing an activity called walking on the line, which requires and practices precise motor movements, because self-control begins with carefully controlling the self. I now want to talk about the importance of repetition, trial, and error. Who knows what this is? Who's played Tetris? Who's played Tetris a lot? The first time you played Tetris, your brain looked like this. Seriously, this is from an actual research study of Tetris, okay? And this is a novice Tetris player's brain, and what it is right now is fully lit up. It's hard to play Tetris, isn't it? There's actually a learning curve that's been identified for Tetris, and when you play Tetris for about 45 days, your brain gets really, really good at it. And the pattern of activation of your brain while playing Tetris goes from this to this. Obviously, the corollary is that video games destroy your brain. No, that's not the corollary. What's happened is this brain has gotten really good at playing Tetris. Now, what's it been doing? It's been trying and failing and trying and failing and trying and failing and trying and failing and getting better, but still trying and failing and getting better, but still trying and failing. And finally, after about 45 days of pretty intense trial and error work, that brain has become an expert at playing Tetris. The only area that you see activated there is the right hand, basically controlling the joystick. Now, that's your brain the first time you sat behind the wheel of a car. And that's what it looked like after you became an expert at driving a car. And for that matter, this is the first time you got on a bicycle. And after you practiced that for a while, this is how it looked later. Because this is the process that your brain goes through whenever you're learning a new skill or activity. trial and error. Your brain learns through trial and error. And you already know this. Think about everything that you do on your job that you had to learn how to do. You know, all meaningful learning takes place through analysis of error. All meaningful learning takes place through analysis of error. And that's how our brains figure things out. What else do we want to say? We want to talk about the importance of environmental enrichment. Because if we are going to give every developing brain its best shot, there's things that we can do to help assure that. One, we could talk about this man, Donald Hebb, who was a rat psychologist and also a very nice father, because it emerges that back in the 40s, when he was in the height of his career, he would sometimes take rats home from his lab for his children to raise as pets. We know that because in 1947 he published a paper about the surprising performance of those rats when they came back to the lab, because when those rats came back to the lab, they were smarter than they were supposed to be. And this was a new finding in 1947. Can you imagine? It must have been that the general feeling was, feed the child until he or she gets old enough to do something interesting, and then we'll educate them. But what Hebb demonstrated was the things that go on in the earliest years are essential for how well that brain will develop. And this paper lit a firestorm. Here's an article from 1962. That's the visual cortex and total cortex size in a rat brain raised in an impoverished environment, and that's what it looks like when it's raised in an enriched environment. It weighs more. There's more connections. It's a smarter, better brain. That's what we get from environmental enrichment. There are certain features that we're aware of that assist with environmental enrichment. Larger spaces, larger groups, opportunities for more complex social interaction, even more complex social interaction, taking place in an environment that is itself more complex. And the studies with animals, they change food locations, they change the materials in the cage, and they also offer them opportunities for physical activity. Guess which is the enriched environment for the rat? Now, everything you want for a developing brain, you simply get more of if that brain is raised under conditions like this. Think about for human children. I also want to talk about the importance of developmental trajectories. Here we have a study published in 1988. This is the developmental jumps and pauses of 4 pairs of identical twins. You follow me here? 4 individual pairs of identical twins. Jump, pause, jump, pause, jump, pause. Are you with me? Strikingly similar. And when you compare across pairs of fraternal twins, what you get is something that's dramatically different. Fraternal twins don't show nearly the same similarity between each other in developmental trajectory. In fact, you probably notice that they don't look like, each pair doesn't look like another pair. Each pair has its own unique trajectory. Each unique configuration of genes has its own developmental trajectory. And when we reduce the number of genes in common by half, the trajectories get different from each other. What this shows us is that the typical expectation for education, that every child will learn at about the same rate and by the end of the school year they'll have gotten through all the same material, it's not so. In fact, anybody who's been in a classroom understands that every child grows and develops at his or her own rate. They start at different points and they end at different destinations. And there's nothing much we can do about that, apparently, because this rate is substantially genetically driven. Now it's the end of the school year. Everybody started someplace different, and everybody ended up someplace different. Finally, I want to talk about, here they are. Here are the 4 concepts that I've talked about. And here's the problem. I think that schools should be for giving every developing brain its best shot. And to do so, teachers must become curators of developmental experience, curators of individualized developmental experience. And here's the problem. While we should be giving that guy opportunities to engage in this kind of activity, what school substantially has become about now, at this point in the 21st century, is this kind of an environment where children sit at desks. He's loving it. Even in early childhood, there's a teacher in charge of this, because here teaching is telling, and even in an early childhood environment, the teacher is in charge. The teacher is telling. The model is that there's content to tell you, the child. We're going to share information with you, and then, of course, we'll give you a test to see how well you're doing. We'll assay your virtue with standardized testing. And there's a problem with that, because when standardized testing enters education, the scope of legitimate activity that can be undertaken in schools narrows automatically and always to those few things that are measured in standardized testing. Yeah, it's actually way more boring than when you were there, because teaching to the test is an epidemic. Teaching to the test is an epidemic around the world. And if you remember nothing else, if someone is trying to sell you standardized testing as a way of improving your society, they are lying to you. You will destroy your public education if you contract this virus of standardized testing. This is one of the outcomes we've experienced in the US. There must be something different. There must be a different way. Okay, thank you. There must be alternative ways of evaluating public education that place the responsibility not on the child's learning of an increasingly narrow set of facts, perhaps evaluating the developmental quality of the environment. There must be something else. If someone is trying to sell you standardized testing, they will destroy your education, and it will take at least a generation to unravel that. Thank you for listening.